So I'm going to start very simply by assuming that aging has something to do with time. And time comes in intervals. And there is this famous contribution to our understanding of time, which is called the Allen interval calculus, which tells us interesting things such as that x takes place before y means something different from x overlaps with y. And no, I don't think so. I can. And it's important to notice that Allen's interval calculus applies to both intervals of time, which form a continuum, and also to processes. So processes occupy intervals of time. But aging also has something to do with death, for the moment anyway. This means that assuming that death is a boundary, which is a question that we will have to worry about later, we need both processes and boundaries of processes. Now, Allen's interval calculus doesn't deal with boundaries. It assumes that intervals are always of finite positive length, where boundaries are of infinitesimal or zero length. Boundaries are things like beginnings and endings, and we'll assume for the moment that death is an ending. So aging relates to death in something like this way, for the moment. I'm trying to be fair to the transhumanists in the audience. Now, there is a question, when does aging begin? We have a fairly clear answer to when aging ends, but we don't have a clear answer to when aging begins. We have a vague answer. Aging begins sometime after conception, for instance. Maybe even that's controversial. I don't want to worry about when aging begins, just as I don't worry about when people become bald. So some people are not bald. At a later time, they are bald. But we shouldn't really worry about the exact instant when they lost the single hair, in virtue of which they were then, from that moment in time, bald. That's the wrong kind of angels on a pinhead question. We should avoid such questions. So we have aging, which is a process which occurs in time, and we have death, which is a boundary which occurs at a point in time. Now, if you look in the Gene Ontology, which we will do in a minute, you will see that death is defined as a biological process. Now, I think dying is a biological process. And again, we have a question, when does dying begin? But we're not going to consider such questions. But it could be that we need to deal with three things. We need to deal with dying, which is part of aging, and we need to deal with death, which is an instantaneous boundary of both aging and dying. I think that's an interesting kind of question if we want to understand the Gene Ontology's treatment of death and how adequate the Gene Ontology's treatment of death might be for our purposes. So the Gene Ontology defines death, I think, unhelpfully from this point of view, namely in understanding whether death is a boundary or a process, as a permanent cessation of all vital functions. The reason why this is unhelpful is because the word cessation is ambiguous in just the same way that death is ambiguous. Cessation could mean the result of a process of cessation, or it could mean that process of bringing it about that all vital functions have ended. So, is death a biological process, or is it the terminal boundary of a biological process? I think this is an interesting philosophico-ontobiological or philosophico-bio-gerontological puzzle. And perhaps one clue as to the correct answer to the puzzle is to look at the annotations to death, which the Gene Ontology provides. So they have 29,488 annotations to death. I think, and I'm guessing here because I didn't check thoroughly, but I think most of them are not to death as a boundary, but to death as a process. which means that the gene ontology should rename death and call it dying. All right, so aging is part of the life of the organism. I think that's uncontroversial. And death is a boundary of the life of the organism. I think that is uncontroversial, but it's controversial whether the gene ontology gets it right. Death is the boundary of the life of the organism. What that means is that every instance of death is the boundary of the life of some single organism. So we never share death. Death cannot be transmitted or migrate from one organism to another. Everyone has their own single. This is boring. Every life of an organism has as its boundary some death. Is, I think, true nearly always, leaving aside some very special kinds of organisms which are immortal. And now it could be that the death is a boundary of the life of an organism, but also the boundary, the initial boundary of a process of abiotic processes in the successor entity to that organism, the corpse. So, aging is part of the life of the organism, but not every instance of the life of an organism has a part aging, because some organisms' lives are cut short by early death. In other words, they die, but they never age. I hope that's uncontroversial. But what does early mean? What does it mean to say that a death is early? So, it's not the case that death is the boundary of a process of aging, because there are some deaths which occur without there having ever been any aging. Moreover, there are some aging processes, which do not end in death because they are premature aging processes followed by rejuvenation, and then perhaps another aging process. So then the question is, what is premature aging? So we have two questions. What is early death? What is premature aging? And both of these questions need to be addressed in connection with a bigger question, namely, what is the life of an organism? Now, a rough and ready answer to that question is it's the sum total of all the processes taking place within the spatiotemporal region occupied by the organism. That is somewhat difficult to specify carefully. For instance, are the processes inside the ear cavity part of the life of an organism? That probably is not too important for the moment, but it's a difficult issue which we would need to address in due course. So we have a sum of all processes taking place within the life of the organism. That is the life of taking place within the spatiotemporal region occupied by the organism as it moves through space in time. Now we have a question. There are age-related causes of death which are distinct from other causes of death. How do we distinguish those two? This is related to the question, how do we distinguish an early death from a appropriately timed death? And how do we distinguish aging from premature aging? All of these questions have to do with the meaning of normal. What is a normal aging process? What does normally mean when we say that an age-related cause of death is a process which is normally a part of the aging process? Now, the answer to that, I don't think we can do aging research without understanding normal aging. How do we understand normal in this context? Well, it's not statistical normality, I don't believe. Rather, it's the kind of normality which Cornelius Ross, who was the founder of the foundational model of anatomy, called canonical. The foundational model of anatomy is still, I think, the best crafted biomedical ontology. And it describes the Bauplan of the human organism as the constellation of body parts at all levels of granularity, from molecules all the way up to the whole body, which is generated by the coordinated expression of the organism's own structural genes. Now, canonical anatomy is, if you like, the ideal anatomy. Craig Venter, probably, or Craig Venter is a good example, has the canonical anatomy. But many people have variant anatomy. So they may have, for instance, a third nipple. So they're not anatomically sick. They aren't missing vital limbs, but they are variants from the canonical anatomy. But other people differ from canonical anatomy, for instance, because they have amputation stumps, or they have wounds, or they have missing teeth. Now, canonically, we all have 32 teeth. Statistically, we do not have 32 teeth. We have 28.2 teeth, or depending on how violent our culture is. So this is a small fragment of the FMA showing the relationship between the interlobar recess and the serous sac cavity subdivision and so forth. So it really is a beautifully crafted ontology. Now, what I'm suggesting is that just as canonically human beings have 32 teeth, because this is part of the genetic bauplan of normal human beings, so canonically, that is to say normally, death is the terminal boundary of a process of aging. And this process of aging is part of the life plan of human beings. This, I hope, is not controversial. I'm just saying it in a way which makes it sound controversial. So we're all intended to go through a process of aging, just as we're intended to go through a process of growth, reproduction, maturity, and so forth. Now, the Go, in fact, is a canonical representation, just like the FMA. So in the 2006 paper, it says the Go is a computational representation of the ways in which gene products normally function in the biological realm. It's not an ontology of all biological processes. It's an ontology of normal biological processes. For instance, it doesn't deal with laboratory biological processes. It represents what is normal in these three domains. What happens when genes, proteins function normally, for instance, in the development of an organism. So, what makes aging processes normal aging processes? We can answer this and the other questions by saying it doesn't fit in the right way into the life plan of an organism of the given type. So it doesn't fit into the canonical cycle of stages. Aging is a stage. Now, I don't know if you've looked at the NCBio Bio portal. It's a very big web repository of ontologies built for biological purposes. And there are far too many ontologies in the bioportal. Most of them are crap. There are some good ones, but the bioportal has too much junk ontology. Now, it's a there are 157 ontologies, for instance, which contain the word obesity in bioportal. That means that bioportal is showing that the ontological goal of avoiding silos in biomedical data has failed, because there are 157 different ways in which you could annotate obesity using ontology. There are only 3 places in the whole of this huge repository where the term reproductive stage appears. Now, if you want to understand a life cycle for a lot of organisms, then the reproductive stage is a really important phenomenon. But there are only actually 2 ontologies. The Plant Ontology, which has as a part the plant structure development stage ontology, and the C. elegans development vocabulary. So this is a kind of miracle. Nobody in the ontology world outside C. elegans and plant is working on stages. That's amazing. I almost died when I saw this. So we are going to start working on stages because aging research needs a good ontology of the stages in a human life. No one did that. The Go didn't do it. The Plant Ontology didn't do it for obvious reasons. So how do we represent an organism's canonical life plan? There are processes in the organism. These processes take place within certain stages in the organism's life cycle, which in turn occupy blocks of time. Now, aging processes typically occur after the stage of maturation. But in abnormal cases, they are premature. And in order to establish that aging processes are occurring at the normal stage, we need an ontology of stages. Now, this is hard. First of all, stages are not simply blocks of time. So not all processes occurring in the organism's reproductive stage are reproductive processes. So while you're in the reproductive stage, you can do other things. Moreover, some stages may overlap. So plants can still go through reproductive processes even when they're in the senescent stage. In fact, fruit ripening is a reproductive process in fruit which occurs in the senescent stage of the life of the whole plant. And that makes the division of stages hard to get your hands on. Moreover, the order in the stages is sometimes different. And this is in part because there are stages of the whole organism, but there are also stages of parts of the organism. So cells have stages. Organs have stages. In plants, as we will see, this is quite radical, the way in which the parts of the plant have stages in contrast to the whole plant. So the Go is not doing a very good job on stages. I'm not sure whether I'm going to bully them into improving their job or whether I'm just going to try and hijack the whole stage issue. At the moment, Go treats stages under three headings. Stages, which seems to be focused on things like hair, mature follicle stage. Phases, which are primarily the meiotic phases in the cell cycle, and in connection with the adjective developmental. So I can show you, but developmental processes are defined by the Go as biological processes whose specific outcome is the progression of an integrated unit from an initial condition to a later condition. It's pretty empty, but it's actually not bad as these things go. So developmental processes are stage processes. For instance, there is developmental pigmentation, which is a developmental process that results in the deposition of coloring matter in an organism, tissue, or cell. So developmental pigmentation is a kind of pigmentation, and it's a kind of developmental process. And pigmentation is defined as just deposition of coloring matter. So this is developmental pigmentation. This is developmental pigmentation. But this is not developmental pigmentation. This is pigmentation during development, which the Go actually defines as a synonym of developmental pigmentation, but it proves my point that just as there are non-reproductive processes which go on during the reproductive stage, for instance, smoking, so there are pigmentation processes which take place during the developmental stage, which is a very big stage because it takes the whole of the life, but which are nonetheless not developmental pigmentation processes. All right, so where can we find a good ontology of stages? The best there is by far, in fact, the only real competitor in this market is the Plant Ontology. The Plant Ontology has stages because plant growers have huge amounts of phenotypic and now they have genotypic data.
So this is a picture of the whole plant development stage in the plant ontology. And as you can see, it's divided into two sub-stages, the gametophyte and the sporophyte development stages, both of which are part of the maximum stage, which is the life of the whole plant. And each of these two sub-stages in turn go through a life cycle: the plant spore stage, the gametophyte vegetative stage, the gametophyte reproductive stage, the gametophyte dormant stage, the gametophyte senescent stage, and similarly on the sporophyte side we go through a similar succession of stages. And from our present point of view, it's the senescent stage which is going to give us an idea about what the aging stage in humans will look like. So here is an example of a definition of a sporophyte development stage. It's a whole plant development stage that has as primary participant a whole plant during the interval between fertilization and death. And note that there are also development stages for the constituent parts of the whole plant, which the plant ontology also deals with in some detail. Now, this is a very good definition of a development stage. It states the onset point, and it states the terminal boundary, and it specifies that the participant is either the whole plant in this case or some organ or other part of the plant in other cases.
Which is even working. So that's the egg. These are the sperm, the plant sperm. And this is an ontologically annotated video, as you will see. And this is the Selaginella apoda, or the Felsenmoosfarn. So this is the plant spore stage. You can see the megaspore being fertilized by the microspores. And this is the vegetative stage, which takes place at around 30 days. That's the plant ontology index number. 38 days, that's the vegetative stage still. And now we have the main shoot growth stage, which is 45 days. That's 55 days. Now we have the formation of the axillary shoot stage, 65 days. And now we have the sporophyte reproductive stage. This is where it gets exciting. So you can see the megaspore, and you can't quite see the microspores yet, although you think you can. The megaspores are the green shiny things. Now we're at 90 days. This is the release of the spores. The microspores were just released. Now the megaspore is released, and that's the end of the video. All right. Now this is the plant biologists are not very interested in plant senescence. And so the video doesn't go into the senescent stage. But senescence looks roughly like this. Dormancy is when the deciduous tree goes to sleep in the winter. That's an important stage. That's death. All right, so the gametophyte senescent stage is defined in terms of the GO multicellular organism aging, which is defined by, and this is good ontology practice. You define terms in plant ontology by referring to gene ontology process terms whenever you can. So a multicellular organism aging is defined as an aging process that has as participant a whole multicellular organism, and aging itself is defined as a developmental process. That means it's not premature. So I think that by adding developmental there, the GO is getting at this staged structure that I referred to. A developmental, that is to say, not premature, that is to say, canonical or normal or part of the life cycle process, that is a deterioration and loss of function over time. And so what this means is that if the GO was to be used to account for premature aging, it would need to have a developmental aging term, which it doesn't have. But it has growth and it has developmental growth, and it has maturation and developmental maturation. It has age-dependent behavioral decline, which is another developmental process term. So that means it's part of the aging stage. And if I put all of this together, then this is a summary of the stage ontology in the Go now. And this is my final slide. This is for postnatal development stages. We have more work to do for pre-birth development. So the life of the whole human being is the maximum stage. And the postnatal development stage is a part of the life of the whole human being. And all of the other stages, growth, maturation, reproduction, age-dependent behavioral decline, and aging, are children of postnatal development stage. And that's basically where I stop.